My boyfriend's mother wanted me gone. So she ended up losing her son. When I first started dating Evan, I believed I understood what slow meant. I believed it meant patience and care and building something steady over time. I did not realize it also meant bracing myself for a woman who would decide from the moment she saw me that I did not belong in her son's life. Evan and I had been together almost 2 years by the time I met his mother, Linda. And even then he warned me carefully that she had strong opinions about who he dated. He said it lightly with an apologetic smile, as if that could soften the truth. I told myself that I was an adult with my own career and my own place and a family that loved me. There was no reason I would not be enough. I worked as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation clinic downtown. Long days but work I cared deeply about. My parents owned a small neighborhood bakery they had run for decades. The kind of place where everyone knew their names and stopped to talk. Evan was finishing his medical residency and talked constantly about the future we were planning, moving in together and finally feeling like our lives were aligning. So when he chose the restaurant for that first meeting and said it was his mother's favorite, I took that as a good sign. I wore something simple and arrived hopeful. Linda came in late, without apology. Her eyes moved over me slowly like she was inspecting something she had already decided to return. The first thing she said was asking Evan why he had not mentioned my background. The word sat heavy between us. She asked what I really did for work, as if physical therapy was a phase and not a profession. She questioned my parents and where they were from, and whether I was with Evan for status he did not even have yet. Evan tried again and again to redirect the conversation, but she spoke over him easily, practiced at dismissing his voice. I left that dinner feeling smaller than when I walked in after that night. Things only escalated. Linda would call Evan while we were together and casually mention women she had met who would be perfect for him. When he reminded her he was in a relationship, she laughed it off and said things were temporary. She showed up unannounced at his apartment and acted shocked every time she saw me there, as if I was an inconvenience that refused to disappear. She spoke often about his ex-girlfriend Amanda and how useful her family connections would be for his future. Evan told her firmly to stop, and she smiled and said she was only making conversation. In his birthday she hosted a party and gave me the wrong address. When Evan called me frantic asking where I was, I realized what she had done. When I finally arrived, she announced loudly that I could not even show up on time. Evan corrected her in front of everyone and she shrugged and said mistakes happen. After that, she began calling me by the wrong name, different names every time. Evan corrected her every single time and she claimed she was terrible with names even though she remembered every stranger she met without fail. The breaking point came on a night Evan was on call at the hospital. Linda showed up at my apartment alone and said we needed to talk like women. She told me plainly that Evan would never marry someone like me because I did not fit into their social world. She said my parents were good people but being shop owners was not the kind of connection Evan needed for his career. She said people like my family always wanted their children to marry up. The words were sharp and careless and cruel. Something inside me finally snapped. I told her she was right about one thing. Evan deserved better than a lifetime of managing his mother's jealousy and control. I said any woman who married him would be signing up for decades of manipulation, and I was not willing to live that way. I told her she had won and that I was done. She smiled then, calm and satisfied, and said she knew I would see reason eventually. An hour later, Evan called me from the hospital after receiving messages from his mother claiming I had shown up at her house and ended things dramatically. I told him the truth. He drove straight to my place, still in scrubs and exhaustion. He cried and begged me not to let her destroy us, but I was empty. I loved him deeply, but I could not imagine a future where I had to fight for basic respect. We broke up that night. The next day, Linda called Evan and suggested he reconnect with Amanda, now that things were resolved. Something inside him shut down after that. He stopped taking her calls, avoided his parents' house, picked up extra shifts and slept at the hospital even when he was not scheduled. His colleagues later said he lost weight fast and looked hollow. His father tried to intervene, but Linda insisted Evan was being dramatic and would get over it 3 months later. Evan made a mistake during a procedure from sheer exhaustion and was placed on medical leave. His attending physician told his parents he was showing signs of severe depression. I heard all of this secondhand and carried it quietly while trying to rebuild my own life. 5 months after the breakup, I met Ryan at my cousin's wedding. He was kind and steady, and his family welcomed me easily. His mother invited me to Sunday dinners without hesitation. It felt peaceful in a way I did not know I had been craving. 6 months after everything fell apart, Linda appeared again. This time at my workplace, first sitting in her car watching the building, then inside the waiting room, and finally approaching me with tears streaming down her face. My coworkers watched as the woman who had made my life miserable begged me to help her son. She looked smaller somehow, like something inside her had cracked. She followed me to the parking lot telling me Evan had not eaten properly in weeks and was living at the hospital. When she grabbed my arm and said he had nearly hurt a patient recently, I pulled away and told her she had gotten exactly what she wanted. I drove home, shaking and conflicted and knowing nothing about my life would ever feel simple again. I drove home, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my hands hurt. My mind pulled in two directions at once because part of me wanted Evan to be okay, and another part was furious that Linda still believed she could reach into my life whenever it suited her. When I walked into the apartment, Ryan was cooking dinner and humming softly. The normalcy of it broke something in me, and I started crying before I could speak. He turned off the stove immediately and guided me to the couch, his hands steady and warm as I told him everything that had happened in the parking lot. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he asked me gently what I wanted to do. I told him I did not know because the truth was that 6 months earlier I had loved Evan enough to picture a life with him, and that kind of love does not disappear neatly. That night sleep would not come. My body was exhausted but my thoughts refused to slow down. I found myself opening Evan's social media for the first time since the breakup. His last post was months old, and even in that photo he looked worn down, thinner than I remembered, and distant in a way that made my chest ache. I scrolled past older photos of us laughing together and closed the app before the memories swallowed me whole. I stared at the ceiling until morning, wondering when things had become this complicated. The next day Linda called my phone over and over until I blocked her number. When that did not work, she started calling my workplace asking for me by name. My supervisor pulled me aside with concern in her eyes and asked if I was dealing with someone who would not leave me alone. I explained enough for her to understand, and she promised to handle it if Linda showed up again. By lunchtime coworkers were checking on me, and I realized how visible this mess had become. So I agreed to meet Linda at a coffee shop just to make the disruption stop. She arrived early and slid photos across the table the moment I sat down. Pictures of Evan that made my stomach twist because he looked sick, pale and exhausted with dark circles under his eyes. She admitted she had underestimated how serious his feelings for me were and said she believed he would recover quickly like he had after other relationships. Instead, he shut down completely. She told me she had seen multiple therapists who all said she caused this by interfering. Her voice dropped, and she would not look at me when she said she finally understood. She destroyed her son's happiness, asked her why she thought I would help after everything she had done. She said she did not deserve my help, but Evan did. She said she would stay completely out of our lives if we tried again. I stood to leave, and she started crying harder, begging me to think about it. I walked out without looking back and sat in my car shaking with emotions I did not want to name. Traffic crawled on the way home, and I replayed her words and the images of Evan over and over until I pulled into a gas station and called my closest friend. Lauren listened quietly while I told her everything. When I finished, she asked the question I had been avoiding since Ryan made dinner the night before. I realized I had been dating Ryan because his life felt calm and his family was easy. Because there was no constant tension or battles to fight. But easy was not the same as right, and admitting that felt disloyal and cruel. Lauren told me to be honest with myself before making any decisions and made me promise to call her the next day. I sat in my car for several more minutes before driving home, feeling like my head might split open. That evening, I told Ryan the truth about where I had gone and who I had seen. He listened carefully and asked if I was thinking about Evan. The answer came out before I could stop it, and I said yes. That Linda's appearance had stirred up feelings I thought were buried. He nodded slowly and thanked me for being honest instead of pretending everything was fine. We finished dinner quietly, and he did not push me to choose or demand reassurance. He simply held my hand while we cleaned up, and that kindness made the guilt heavier the next morning. I could not focus at work. My supervisor noticed and offered me the afternoon off if I needed space to think. Instead, I texted Evan's friend Mark, who worked at the same hospital, and asked if we could meet after his shift. He agreed immediately. The rest of the day dragged and my nerves buzzed as I watched the clock. At the coffee shop, Mark arrived in scrubs, looking as tired as Evan had in those photos. I asked him directly how bad things really were. Mark did not sugarcoat anything. He said Evan was barely holding it together and had lost the spark that once made him such a good doctor. The attending physicians were worried about his exhaustion and depression leading to serious mistakes. He said Evan worked double shifts and slept at the hospital to avoid going home, eating only when someone forced food on him. Therapy had been mandated, but Evan was going through the motions without opening up. Mark leaned forward and said he believed I was the only person who might reach him because Evan refused to even say my name or talk about the breakup, as if acknowledging it would make it. Really drove home feeling like a weight had settled on my chest. Ryan was at practice and the apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Mark's words echoed in my head for days, and Ryan noticed my distraction during every quiet moment. When he asked me again if I was thinking about Evan, I told him yes, because lying felt worse. I explained about meeting Mark and learning how severe Evan's depression had become and how I felt responsible even though I knew I was not. Ryan listened and said he appreciated my honesty. His sadness was quiet and steady, and somehow more painful than anger. One night, I lay awake until early morning and finally reached for my phone. Evan's number was still there untouched. My hands shook as I pressed call before I could change my mind. It rang several times before he answered, sounding half asleep, and when I said his name there was a long silence before he said mine, like he could not believe it. We talked for 15 minutes and his voice sounded hollow and broken. He apologized for his mother and for not standing up to her sooner. He said he did not blame me for leaving and knew I had protected myself. He admitted he had not been honest in therapy because talking about losing me made it permanent. He asked if I was happy with Ryan, and I tried to say yes, but the word caught in my throat, and the pause told him everything. He said he did not want to disrupt my life, but if there was any chance I still had feelings, he would do whatever it took to fix things, including finally setting boundaries with his mother. I told him I needed time to think, and he said he would wait as long as it took. After we hung up, I cried alone on the couch, realizing I never stopped loving him. I had only learned how to survive without him. When Ryan came home later that night, he could see something had changed. I told him about the call and about Evan's condition and apologies. He listened quietly and then said he had known part of me was still elsewhere. He said he cared about me but would not be someone's safe option. The truth slipped out before I could stop it when I said he was the safe choice, and the hurt on his face confirmed what we both knew. We agreed to take space so I could sort through my feelings, and that night I slept in the guest room. The following week, I moved back to my apartment. Ryan helped carry boxes with a kindness that made everything harder. The place felt empty in a different way than before. That evening Lauren arrived with wine and asked what I was going to do. I admitted I still loved Evan but was terrified nothing would truly change with his mother. Lauren said people could change but only with real work, and asked if I was willing to risk being hurt again to find out. I did not have an answer, and sat with that uncertainty, knowing whatever I chose would change everything. 3 days later, Evan's father Thomas called me, and I stared at his name on my phone while it rang. He had never contacted me directly before, and that alone made my stomach tighten. When I answered, he asked if we could meet for coffee because there was something important he needed to say. His voice sounded strained and sincere enough that I agreed, even though part of me worried this was another attempt to pull me back into chaos. We chose a small cafe near my apartment, and I arrived early with my nerves buzzing. Thomas was already there with 2 coffees waiting, and he stood when he saw me like he was unsure of his place. He apologized almost immediately for never stepping in when Linda treated me badly. The words came out, rushed and heavy, like he had practiced them. He said he thought staying neutral would keep peace in the family, but now understood it only enabled her behavior. He admitted that watching Evan collapse over the past months forced him to face how damaged their family dynamics had become. He explained that Linda grew up in constant financial insecurity and became obsessed with status and control as a way to cope. He said it did not excuse anything but might explain why she reacted so aggressively to me and my background. Thomas told me he had started therapy himself and was learning about control and enmeshment and how his silence had harmed his son. He said he had told Linda she needed serious long-term therapy if she wanted any relationship with Evan going forward, and that he was prepared to separate from her if she refused to change. When I asked if he truly meant that, he looked me in the eye and said yes, because he was not willing to lose his son to protect his marriage. He said Linda was in therapy now, but real change would take time and might never fully come. He said he wanted me to understand exactly what I would be walking back into if I considered giving Evan another chance. Linda had good weeks and bad weeks, and Thomas was trying to hold her accountable, but it was not perfect. He admitted he was terrified they had permanently damaged Evan and destroyed his chance at happiness. His voice broke when he said Evan used to be an easy, joyful kid, and seeing him hollowed out had been the worst experience of his life. He told me to take my time deciding and promised Evan would wait. Then he left me alone with cold coffee and a head full of questions. The next 2 days I replayed that conversation while trying to work. My patients noticed my distraction, and one asked gently if I was all right. I smiled and said I was fine, even though I was not sure what fine meant anymore. On Thursday morning, I scheduled a therapy appointment for myself and took the first available slot before I could overthink it. The office was quiet and neutral, and the therapist, Dr. Miller, listened without interrupting as I spilled everything about Evan and Linda and Ryan and my fear of making the wrong choice. Miller asked me what I wanted rather than what made the most sense, and the question stopped me cold. After a long pause, I admitted I wanted Evan but was terrified of repeating the same pain. She asked why the thought of failing again scared me more than the first time, and I realized it was because then I could believe it simply was not meant to be, but now I would know for sure that love alone might not be enough. She pointed out that I had left the stability Ryan offered just to consider Evan again, which suggested my feelings were deeper than I wanted to admit. That night, I called Mark and asked how Evan was really doing in therapy. He said something shifted after our phone call, and Evan finally opened up about everything. He was attending sessions twice a week and engaging honestly instead of going through motions. Progress was slow but real, and Mark said Evan was trying in a way he had not before. 2 days later, I texted Evan asking if he wanted to meet for coffee, and he responded immediately. We chose a place halfway between our apartments, and I arrived early with my nerves fluttering. When Evan walked in, I barely recognized him at first. He had lost weight and looked pale with dark circles under his eyes. But when he saw me, there was a softness in his expression that made my chest ache. We hugged awkwardly and sat across from each other, and he apologized for how he looked. We talked for hours about everything that had happened, and he took full responsibility for not protecting our relationship. He did not make excuses or minimize his mother's behavior. He said he had been raised to keep peace at all costs and never learned it was okay to choose his own happiness. He told me therapy was helping him see how his mother's love came with conditions, and how his father's neutrality reinforced that pattern. He said he was committed to unlearning it because he could not live like that anymore. He was not asking me to take him back immediately, and said he wanted to prove through actions that he was changing. He asked if I would stay in contact while he worked on himself and maybe try again later if I was open to it. I told him I still had feelings but needed to see real boundaries before considering anything. Over the next few weeks, we texted regularly and met for coffee a couple more times. I noticed he looked healthier and more present. He talked about returning to old hobbies and feeling more like himself. Then Linda called me again asking if she could apologize in person, and my instinct was to refuse. I called Evan and he said his therapist believed accountability could be helpful if it was done correctly, and offered to be there as a buffer. After thinking about it for days, I agreed to meet under that condition. We met at a neutral restaurant, and Linda apologized in a rehearsed, careful way, listing specific things she had done wrong. She spoke about her childhood and control issues and promised to respect whatever boundaries we set. Part of it sounded genuine, and part of it sounded practiced. I noticed she kept glancing at Evan for approval and pointed it out. She bristled at first, then admitted it was a habit she was still trying to break. When we left, Evan and I talked about how the apology felt incomplete but showed some effort. A week later, Evan asked if I was ready to try being together again with clear rules about his mother. I told him I wanted to but needed concrete boundaries, and he agreed immediately. We met at my apartment with notebooks and wrote everything down from limited contact to immediate consequences for manipulation. I told him if he broke those boundaries even once, I was done for good, and he said he understood and accepted that. We signed the list like a contract, which felt strange but necessary. Told Ryan the truth the next day, and he said he hoped I knew what I was doing, even though it hurt. Months passed, and Evan continued therapy and held boundaries consistently even when it was uncomfortable. Linda tested them, and Evan shut it down each time. Slowly, I began to believe that something fundamental had changed. Not because Linda was suddenly different, but because Evan finally was. As Evan and I settled back into each other's lives, the rhythm felt cautious but intentional. We went on simple dates and checked in often about how we were feeling. Every conversation included space for concerns that would have been swallowed before. He continued therapy consistently and shared insights without defensiveness. It was strange and comforting to see him speak openly about emotions he once avoided. The biggest difference was how quickly he addressed issues with his mother instead of minimizing them. When Linda called too often or pushed for information, he shut it down calmly and followed through with consequences. A few months into rebuilding, Evan came to my apartment one evening looking lighter than I had seen him in nearly a year. He told me his therapist had guided him through a breakthrough that day. He had finally confronted the fear of disappointing his mother and realized her emotional reactions were not his responsibility to manage. He talked for a long time about guilt and obligation and how he had confused them with love since childhood. As he spoke, I watched tension lift from his shoulders, and I could feel hope returning carefully. Linda did not change overnight, and she tested boundaries in subtle, familiar ways. She called repeatedly when Evan did not answer immediately, and left messages implying I was keeping him from family. She made comments about my parents' business and finances that echoed her old judgments. Each time Evan addressed it directly, and ended the call without engaging further. Thomas backed him up every time and apologized to me privately when Linda crossed lines. Slowly she began to understand that these boundaries were real, and not negotiable. 5 months after Evan returned to limited duties, his attending physician cleared him for full responsibilities at the hospital. The meeting went better than he dared to hope, and he came straight to my apartment, overflowing with relief. He told me his focus was back, and that colleagues noticed the change in him. He no longer hid at the hospital to avoid his feelings and instead felt present and capable again. Watching him reclaim that part of himself confirmed that the work he was doing was real. Thomas took me aside during a supervised dinner and thanked me for giving Evan another chance. He admitted he should have stepped in years earlier and promised again that he would never enable Linda's behavior at the expense of his son. His sincerity mattered because I could see he was finally choosing Evan over avoiding conflict. The dinners remained limited and structured, and Linda struggled with her reduced role, but she was trying. 6 months after Linda had begged me in my workplace, Evan and I were stable and intentional about our relationship. We had weekly check-ins where we talked openly about any issues, no matter how small. Linda continued therapy and made slow, uneven progress. Sometimes she slipped into old habits, but Evan remained firm every time. Consistency became our foundation, and trust grew slowly but steadily. Eventually, Evan suggested we look at apartments together. The idea scared me and excited me in equal measure. We spent weekends touring places until we found one that felt neutral and new. Sunlight filled the rooms, and the kitchen was big enough to share. Signing the lease felt like crossing an invisible line into something serious and earned. That night, Evan told his parents about our plans. Thomas congratulated us immediately, and Linda paused before offering support that sounded tentative but restrained. Before moving in, Evan insisted on setting house rules with his parents in person. We sat in their living room, and he explained calmly that Linda would need to call before visiting and would not have a key. When she protested, Thomas cut her off and supported Evan completely. Her disappointment was visible, but she agreed. Moving day arrived quietly, and Linda brought a small gift and stayed for exactly the agreed amount of time before leaving without snooping or criticism. It felt like a small victory. Around the same time, I reached out to Ryan to return his belongings. Meeting him was emotional but necessary. He looked healthy and introduced me to someone he was seeing, and I felt relief knowing he had moved forward. We spoke honestly about the past and parted without bitterness. It felt like closing a chapter properly. Evan planned a weekend away to celebrate settling in. A quiet cabin where we cooked and hiked and let ourselves breathe. One night under the stars, he pulled out a simple ring and told me he wanted a future built on shared decisions and firm boundaries. I said yes, because I believed he was finally capable of protecting that promise. The moment felt earned rather than rushed. The year after our breakup passed differently than I expected. Evan and I planned our wedding thoughtfully and small. Linda struggled with her limited role and made suggestions that Evan shut down immediately. Thomas continued to support boundaries and even accompanied Linda to therapy sessions when needed. Progress remained imperfect, but real. Our apartment became a place of routine and comfort and honesty. We handled conflicts directly and refused to let resentment build. Evan stayed in therapy even when things were good, and I learned to speak up without fear of being labeled difficult. Together, we built something resilient rather than fragile. Looking back, I understood that Linda losing control had cost her the closeness she wanted with her son, but her attempt to push me out had forced Evan to choose himself, and in doing so, he finally chose us. Planning the wedding brought a different kind of stress than I expected. Not the sharp anxiety of before, but a steady awareness that every choice reflected the life Evan and I were intentionally building. We chose a small venue in the spring with space for people who genuinely supported us. Linda called several times in the first week after we announced the engagement with suggestions about the guest list and decor. Evan shut each one down calmly and reminded her she was attending as a guest, not a decision maker. When she cried to Thomas afterward, he took her to therapy and reinforced the same message. Watching Evan stay firm without anger or guilt made me feel safer than any promise ever had. As months passed, Linda's behavior improved in some ways and faltered in others. She learned to ask about my work without veiled insults and stopped making comments about status. But she still tested limits with subtle remarks about tradition or family expectations. Each time Evan addressed it immediately, and followed through with reduced contact when needed. There were moments when I saw frustration flicker across his face, but he never wavered. Consistency became the language through which trust grew. Living together deepened everything. Mornings meant shared routines and quiet conversations over coffee. Evenings meant cooking side by side and talking through the day honestly. When disagreements surfaced, we handled them directly instead of letting them fester. Evan interrupted patterns he had lived with his entire life, and I learned not to minimize my discomfort to keep peace. The work was ongoing, but it felt mutual. Thomas continued to play a quiet but crucial role. He checked in regularly with Evan, and with me, and made it clear he would not allow Linda to undermine our relationship. During family dinners, he redirected conversations when they veered into unsafe territory, and backed Evan up without hesitation. Seeing a parent actively choose their child's well-being changed the entire dynamic. A few weeks before the wedding, Evan received confirmation that his standing at the hospital was fully restored. His supervisors noted his renewed focus and leadership and asked him to mentor new residents. The pride on his face when he told me reminded me how much he had lost and how far he had come back. He was no longer surviving his career, he was engaged with it again. As the wedding approached, Ryan crossed my mind less often, but when he did, it was with gratitude rather than regret. We exchanged brief messages, wishing each other well, and it felt clean and honest. Lauren stood by me through every step and reminded me how strong I had become, even when I doubted myself. She told me I was not choosing comfort or chaos anymore but intention. The night before the wedding, Evan and I spent apart as planned. I stayed with Lauren and lay awake thinking about the path that led here, the heartbreak and fear and long uncomfortable conversations. I realized the story was never just about a difficult mother but about learning where responsibility ended and self-respect began. Evan had learned it for himself, and I had learned it for me. The ceremony was simple and warm. The room filled with people who had watched us struggle and grow. Linda arrived quiet and composed and stayed within every boundary that had been set. When Evan and I exchanged vows, he spoke about partnership and choice and protecting what we built together. His words carried weight because they were backed by action. At the reception, Linda approached me briefly and congratulated me without qualifiers. It was not perfect warmth, but it was sincere enough to accept. Thomas stood nearby and gave me a look that said he was paying attention. That reassurance mattered more than the words themselves. After the wedding, life did not suddenly become easy, but it became honest. Linda continued therapy and continued to struggle. Sometimes she slipped and sometimes she caught herself. Evan maintained boundaries even when it meant uncomfortable distance. We adjusted family routines as needed and prioritized our shared life without apology. One evening months later, as we sat in our apartment surrounded by familiar quiet, Evan admitted he sometimes grieved the mother he wished he had. I told him that grief made sense and did not negate the progress he had made. Loving someone did not mean sacrificing yourself to them. We held that truth together. Looking back, I understood that Linda's attempt to remove me from Evan's life had forced a reckoning she never anticipated. In trying to control the outcome, she lost the power she once held. Evan chose himself, and in doing so, chose a future built on respect rather than fear. She lost a version of her son who would bend to keep peace and gained one who stood firm. Our life together is not defined by her absence or presence, but by the boundaries we maintain, by conversations we continue to have, and by the mutual commitment to protect what we built. The story did not end with someone winning or losing, but with clarity. Linda wanted me gone, and in the end, she lost control over her son's life. Evan and I gained something harder and more valuable than approval. We gained the ability to choose each other freely, and that made all the difference.